I'm Greg Hunter. Welcome to USAWatchdog.com. Well, it's a real treat. She comes out at least 4 times a year. This is the first quarter report. And I really wanted to get into this, fascinating, because I'm giving it away, so the Solari Report, who's who and what's up in the space-based economy. And it's really super well done. I say this all the time. This is what the subscribers get, quarterly, glossy, well done, very highbrow stuff, talking about all about the space-based economy and about, the entrainment of all the movies that they've had where, they kind of reveal what they're doing. But this is really kind of cool. It gives a smattering, a part of the companies that are involved in space, and there are a lot of big name companies involved in this. You look at all the companies involved in space exploration, building of space components, rockets, space stations, whatever it is. And this is just there's an Asian version and a European version on her website. It's the Solari Report. The publisher of the Solari Report at Solari.com is none other than Catherine Austin Fitts. Catherine Austin Fitts, thanks for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com.
Hey, Greg, it's great to be back.
Your resume is a huge resume. You're a former investment banker. Right now, you give consultation, or you're a money advisor around the world. You advise people with big money, just so people know, a little bit of your experience. You were assistant housing and urban development secretary. Is that right? Assistant, right? Number two level.
Assistant Secretary of Housing, Federal Housing Commission. One of the longest titles in the government.
Yeah, but high up, you're in the second shelf tier of people with, probably hundreds, maybe thousands of people working for you. So, but that was something in the past, and you do the Solari Report. You're so well, along with your investment advice to people globally. You travel the world. One day you're in Europe, the next day you're in, Australia. But anyway, let's talk about the space-based economy. The 21 missing $1 trillion has to play into the space-based economy, correct? The missing money that you're talking about?
Right. One of the things that led me to space is I started to look, where is all this money that's going missing from the federal government going? And it led me into space and lots of questions. Now, in the last few years, Greg, the commitment of the federal government and the Asian governments to space, and the European governments, has become much more overt and committed, and of course the involvement of the private sector. Because now, with the changes in material science and all sorts of different technologies, it's becoming much more feasible to do manufacturing and mining and other things in space. And so you see a lot of the corporate world lining up to do this, particularly the companies that have had a history in defense. There's a lot of crossover between defense and space for obvious reasons. And we see I don't know if you saw the president's speech in San Diego in March, but basically what he alluded to, he talked about we have an Air Force, we need a Space Force, and we need a Space Corps. So, the president is putting big bets on basically control and dominance from space and sort of military and space weaponry. So whether it's communications, whether it's Earth observation, whether it's GIS, whether it's military, the investment in space is growing very, very quickly. We see a series of different analyst reports proposing that the space-based economy is going to be in the many trillions within 20 or 30 years. So, there's a lot of disagreement about all the different involvements, but the reality is more and more of what we're doing on Earth can be facilitated in the suborbital platform. So the Internet of Things, big plans to deliver and manage things from the suborbital platform. And then, of course, there's a real push to create colonies on Mars and become a multiplanetary civilization. Either way you cut it, the growth in space is significant.
We were talking a little bit about this in the pre-interview, and I was thinking, wow, this is going to be great for mankind. And you quickly shot back, no, not the way they're doing it. Explain.
Well, first of all, the uncertainty about what's going on in space is extraordinary. It's one of the things I talk about in this first quarter wrap-up. What are the unanswered questions, and what do they mean? There's some things that are happening in space which are wonderful and exciting. So the idea of becoming a multiplanetary civilization, creating human colonies on Mars, I think, and exploring space, So I think that's very positive and very exciting. And if you look at the technological applications and developments coming out of that, they are also very exciting. So again, what we're doing with material sciences to me is fantastic. So, one of my favorite quotes about space is from Bob Dean, who says it's the destiny of my children and grandchildren and the children in my family to travel the stars. So I think that's very exciting. At the same time, if you look at how the suborbital platform and the orbital platform around Earth is being used, and you study the investments that are going in, a lot of it comes down to control. Control of what's going on in the planet. So, for example, Morgan Stanley in 2017 published a big study on space. And one of the things they show is that a lot of the economic growth comes from the Internet of Things. And the big application, the mega application, is driverless cars and all the data that comes off of that. We see a recent report from The Economist that says, watch out, are they going to try and control who can get in a car and who can't? Or if you're not good, your car stops. So there are real questions about to what extent is space going to be used to really inflict dominance by a few players who can afford to get up there and run the platform.
The missing one of the things in here in the Solari Report, and listen, folks, I cannot get to all this. It's you really should become a subscriber. I cannot do everything in this interview, but I want to tell you some of the things that just jumped out at me. And one of the things that jumped out at me was on page. It starts on page 25, and then the article goes off on page 28. We talked about it in the pre-interview. And we're talking about the rape of Russia. Could it happen here? And, we already have pension funds that are being, as you've said in the past, vacuum dry. They're putting real money in, and they're vacuuming out the real money and giving it worthless IOUs. Could America be raped? And could we actually, when you're talking about IOUs, you're talking about treasuries. And could the treasury market be defaulted on one way or the other? Hyperinflated, which is a default, or them just saying, sorry, we can't pay you that back. I mean, that's what's happening. Go ahead.
I'm very concerned about this, Greg. And you know me, I haven't been concerned about the dollar or the federal credit, since I've known you. In fact, we've argued a lot about that. But I'm starting to get very concerned. And part of the reason is, number one, I did a major study on pension funds. We talked about it last quarter. But it's in the annual wrap-up. And one of the things I show is the biggest buyers of the treasuries are U.S. pensions. And basically, the U.S. pensions are buying trillions of dollars of treasuries, and the money goes into the government, and then the money goes out the back door. But meantime, the taxpayers, including those pension beneficiaries, are on the hook for those treasuries. So you're giving away real money, and all you're getting is a liability, which is a put back to you.
Wow.
And so the federal government literally becomes a laundry mechanism that, it's a little bit like a restaurant where the chef is taking all the money, the food out the back door. So, that was a real concern. And then I started to see multiple efforts, I would call them disinformation efforts, fear porn, hope porn, all pushing the idea of what a great idea it would be to dissolve the U.S. government and auction off the assets, which is basically the rape of Russia plan. The U.S. Treasury and CIA and law firms and investment banks went into Russia with Harvard as the financial advisor and basically did the rape of Russia. In essence, that rape is what led to Putin and a lot of the tensions we have today. So, there's a lot of obstacles legally called the Constitution to doing that in America. But if you look at the, sort of the efforts I'm seeing all over the country to sell this to young people as something really hip, cool, and fashionable, it's beginning to scare me. Because now part of this is you have the corporations very much needing new profits, new sources of profits. And the question is, they can absolutely do that by privatizing government. But I mean by privatize is, privatization is when I transfer an asset out of government at market price. Privatization is when I transfer it out at 10 cents on the dollar. And a lot of the plans I'm hearing are proposing just that we do things that implode the U.S. economy and then privatize the assets. Now, corporations can make a lot of money and they can keep their earnings up. You can keep the stock market up. And we have a very ugly game between the Congress and the corporations, where Congress does things that cause the profits to go up, and then the corporations send in, the campaign contributions out of the capital gains on their stocks, or real estate. So the question is are the corporations and private investors really looking to re-engineer the federal government, state and local government, and make money off of a radical re-engineering in a way that's bad for the taxpayers? And I would say, if taxpayers have been buying treasuries and the money going out the back door, and you're seeing lots of ideas floated about partial defaults or dissolving the U.S. government and paying the debt back off by auctioning off all the assets, it's pretty scary.
When you talk about the rape of the United States, you're talking about that they would just dissolve the current government, do away with the Constitution, and hey, y'all, we're going to own everything. Is that what you're talking about?
There are many, many different ways of doing it. You see tremendous efforts right now to open up the Constitution, which is, as you know, I think is the most dangerous thing. If there's one thing we need, it's law. But what I'm saying is, you've got a series of efforts to market what I would describe as lawlessness.
Would you call it the rape? Would you call this the rape of the United States?
Yeah, so let me give you another example. We saw the head of HHS resign recently. I'm sorry, the head of Veterans Affairs resign recently. And as he walked out the door, he published a big editorial in the New York Times saying, beware, there are proposals floating around that are being very aggressively marketed to privatize the VA, and it's a disaster. Don't do it.
And this is all part of the rape of America.
Right.
In other words, and just let me get in there, because this is really important. Because I'm not being, I'm not hyperventilating here when I say the rape of America. I mean, if you would describe what was going on, you would actually call it the rape of America. Is that right?
What I would say is, unacceptable levels of lawlessness in trying to pick over government assets and operations by the private sector. I would say, think of this as a group of LBO firms moving, instead of moving on smaller companies, they're moving on government. They're also going to move on small business. I think there's going to be an effort after the election to basically re-engineer as much small business income into corporate monopolies. So you have government working hand in hand, or policymakers working hand in hand with private corporations to asset strip small business and asset strip government to create more corporate profits.
And that's exactly what they did in Russia in the rape of Russia. So this would be, in effect, the rape of America.
Right. So let me give you an example. I was at a conference in the Aspen Institute in September. So this is the Aspen Institute in Aspen, Colorado, very well-heeled crowd. And I go to a presentation by an activist who says, here's what we ought to do. I'm running for president on the Libertarian ticket. I'm going to, when I win, what I'm going to do is I'm going to dissolve the U.S. government, and then I'm going to auction off all the assets to try and pay the liabilities. Now, I stood up and I said, well, it's very interesting. You should propose this, because this is what they called this was the rape of Russia. This is exactly what you did. And I said, let me explain how this is going to work. In every county in America, 50% or more of the household incomes and small business incomes comes directly or indirectly from the federal government. So you have military pensions, you have food stamps, you have Social Security, you have Medicare, you have Medicaid, on and on and on and on. You have community block development grants, you have all sorts of government purchases and contracts. So what you're going to do is you're going to stop 50% of the household incomes overnight, like that. Again, exactly what they did in Russia. And what that means is most households say they have 3 weeks of food, 3 weeks of cash, and they can go 3 weeks without food. So that means after 9 weeks, you're going to have die off. Now in Russia, apparently 25 million people died in the 2 or 3 years after this happened. So you had significant depopulation happen as a result of this. So you implode the economy, which means the value of everything crashes. At that point, if you're going to auction off the national parks, the only people who are going to have cash is Goldman Sachs and their friend, and they're going to be able to buy things on penny on the dollar. So I said, now tell me why this is a good plan. And the guy says, oh, we don't need government. We don't need, everything will be groovy. We'll use Bitcoin as our currency and everything will be fine. And, the audience was, but the audience was clapping for him. Now, I just, this guy, but Cynthia McKinney.
The audience were clapping because they were going to be the winners.
No, they're not. When their parents and grandparents move in with them.
Oh.
I mean, there is an enormous level of ignorance about how the money works in our own household budgets, in our own community, in our own neighborhood. It's quite remarkable. But no one seemed to understand. It was really funny. There was one person clapping who I know lives entirely on Social Security. And I said to them later, he was proposing to cancel your Social Security. What are you planning on living on? And there was sort of and they said, well, I'm sure he didn't mean that. I said, no, he really did. That's what he said.
Boy, because people have to understand that we've got a $21 trillion. I've talked about this with Dr. Skidmore, a brilliant guy. You've had it on you were first to have this Solari report. You were the first to bring it up, as a matter of fact. And he actually did his report because of you, because, that can't be right. Captain Austin Fitz can't be right. Oh, you weren't right. You were low. You were.
Right, but let me give you another example.
Okay.
I was talking to a venture capitalist who's very successful, not that long after the speech I just described. And he looked at me dead in the eye and he said, look, we can use artificial intelligence, software, and robotics to replace every job in America. And that's what we're going to do. And that's just the way it is. And, we don't care. So what I'm telling you is we have a leadership group that has gotten new technology, and they literally think as predators, they can move in, ignore the law, whether it's the Constitution or state and local laws, and basically take over everything.
Which is why they want to get rid of the Second Amendment. That's why they want to get rid of it.
The first thing they wanted to do was they wanted to get rid of net neutrality. Because basically getting rid of net neutrality means as a legal matter, if I'm AT&T, I can block whoever I want. I don't have to explain. I don't have to tell my customers. So if you're a customer and you sign up to subscribe to the Solari Report, they can block you. And there's nothing, and they don't have to tell you they're blocking you, and they can move in. You can use control of the internet in that way, and freedom to do, as a legal matter, tortious interference, to move in and scarf up all small business income.
And you have been blocked. Do you want to talk about that? AT&T has been blocking you legitimately. They've been not. I don't know how legitimate it is, but that's a legitimate problem you have.
I've published 2 articles. One was we had to finally write a recommendation to our subscribers saying, look, you can't, and if you go to our store, what we say is if you can't subscribe to the Solari Report with an AT&T email because we can't reach you by email and so we can't communicate, and you may get blocked on your, we've had indications that there may be blocks on the website and your phone as well. It's not as clear cut. But we've communicated with AT&T since February steadily, and there's nothing we can do. They won't respond, and they have a pipe, and their attitude is they control entirely who goes through that pipe, and it doesn't matter what their customers sign up for or want. Now, I don't, this is not about what they're doing in the Solari Report. I called my attorneys before I published the article and I said, I just want you to check this. Now, is what they're doing legal? And they said, once the FCC tore up the rules, this is as long as it's under their terms and condition, they can block anybody all day long and not inform their users all day long. It's totally legal. Now, what that means is if you want to privatize and piratize federal, state, and local government, you can basically kill switch any user, any media, anything, through a small number of big telcos. It's really interesting, Greg. After I did your show last time, I had an executive from AT&T call or email and say, I heard you on Greg Hunter. I can give you a complete cyber security solution. We can do a new website for you and you'll be fine. I said, great. Could you lift your block? So he says, what block? He has his technical guys go into their internal system and he says, we've checked you on the internal system. He sent me a screenshot. He said, there's no block on you. You're clean and there's no reason for a block. And I said, well, you got a super secret crypto security block system that you and your technical guys don't know about. Because we had the documentation, we published it. We can prove there's an AT&T block.
I've had people get emails from me and from a variety of email servers, not all of them, but some of them. And, somebody will make a donation, I'll say thank you. Or somebody asks a question, I'll say, here's your answer. Or here's a link. Or somebody may say, oh, what was a link that the Solari Report gave? Here it is. And it ends up in their spam file. And I had to go, and every week I'm out there telling people, hey, I'm not being, snooty or anything and not answering your questions or thanking you for donations or answering your questions or whatever. Your stuff is ending up in the spam file. And I had dozens of people say, you were right. I looked at my spam file. There's your thank you, or there's your answer, or there's your this. It's unbelievable.
We've always had our own email servers, but for a period we had to go into an Exchange server as a phase. And it was amazing because the whole Microsoft system was set up to basically send all independent media or most independent media from what it looked like to me into the spam filter. So anyway, but here's what's important. By tearing up net neutrality, there are two things you need to really make this move or several things you need to make this move on small business and small business income. One is you need to tear up net neutrality, which they've done, although the states are fighting back. The second thing you need to do, Greg, is tear up the Second Amendment. You got to pull in the guns. And that's a real fight, and they're having a terrible fight about it. But then the other thing you got to do is you got to keep the pension funds buying treasuries. And those are the three things you've got to do. And that's why bringing up the 21 trillion, they're doing a lot to make it look like they're addressing the 21 trillion missing, which they're not.
Yeah. Anybody with a pension, when you're talking about treasuries, you're talking about there could be a hyperinflation, an outright default. This is coming from, you're worried about the dollar. I want you to talk about why you're so worried about the dollar. You've never been before. We've had bets about the dollar going up, which you've always won because you're smarter than me. Go ahead. What are you worried about the dollar, the treasury market, the dollar? Why are you so worried?
Here's what I'm worried about. One, we have an economic model which is dependent on a war and lawlessness. Okay? Mm-hmm. And it's my old story about the Senate staffer telling me that the U.S. government was being run as a criminal enterprise. So we have an economic model that's dependent on crime. And the lawlessness and the corruption is reaching levels that, to me, as a financial professional, make me very nervous about the credit quality of anything related to the U.S. government, because you cannot tolerate this amount of lawlessness and still trust the function. So I'm not worried about the fundamental economics. The fundamental economics come down to how good the U.S. military is up against all the military on the planet, including the Russian and Chinese, because the U.S. dollar depends entirely at this point on force. It's a military question. And, even Mattis, when he was going through confirmation, he was very, very gracious about the way he did it. But basically what he said is we're over dependent on our military supremacy to maintain the reserve currency, and we need to do things to change that. Because you can't do this from force, but they're trying to. And if you look at all the silly business in the Middle East, that's a lot of what it relates to, is keeping that model going. And that's why the problem with the U.S. dollar is it's dangerous and dominant. And the reality here is you hit a certain point in a system where lawlessness hits a certain point, and then people just start to walk away. It's not a matter of price. It's not a matter of, it's a matter of, you've seen or heard where all the animals decide that the one animal is diseased and they all start, marching away. So what concerns me about the US government is we're reaching a level of lawlessness and corruption, which is, when somebody the other day said to me, America's lost its mind. And so my concern is the lawlessness, because I don't see how you maintain a credit worthiness in a market this big with this much lawlessness.
And they're going after, case in point, going after the president's attorney. I mean, they didn't get him on collusion or whatever else it was, and all the, whatever else, Stormy Daniels. I mean, this is what they're doing. And going after Cohen and threatening to throw him in jail for whatever. I mean,
what's so strange. What's so strange is, I'd love to know what's really going on, and I don't think we know. What's strange is Mueller was appointed to look at Russian compromise of the election, with the Trump campaign. And after a year, many, many months of investigation, what they've come up with is so de minimis and pathetic that you can't believe it's not shut down.
Well, the real collusion happened with Hillary Clinton and the FBI and DOJ, and I heard Joe DeGenova last week talk about how this is a conspiracy by all the Democrats, the Obama administration, everybody in the DOJ, and Comey, McCabe, Strzok, Loretta Lynch. This is a conspiracy to frame an incoming president. And you can't get around that, is what DeGenova said, former federal prosecutor. I mean, this is a huge constitutional crisis in the government. We've never had this before.
I would say it's worse than that. But
well, why? How worse?
There was an effort to falsely frame both the Russians and the Trump campaign before the election. After the election, there was an attempt to overturn the election by using that false frame to hold Trump accountable for something that was faked up. It all failed, and it turned out the Russians that I've seen so far, whatever involvement they had in the campaign was almost nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the reasons
not a single vote was changed. Not a single vote was changed, according to Obama intelligence officials. Not a single vote was changed.
Well, if you look at why they got Mark Zuckerberg in to do the testimony, one of the reasons they did was to try and make it look like Mueller had something. I mean, essentially, what Mueller has come up with on the Russian stuff is all Democrats trying to falsely frame. So to say that Mueller at this point, the effort based on the scope looks pathetic, and it should be shut down. Now, I think the reason that Rosenstein kicked in, basically what Rosenstein did and the Department of Justice did is they kicked it into the civil service in the New York district, out of Mueller's hands into the line bureaucracy, and now they're taking a new tack that has nothing, I'm assuming, to do with Russian interference. Now, is it going to bring up involvement of Trump with the Russian mafia before the election? Sure, but who cares? I think everything that they come up with through Cohen is going to be pathetic. It's going to tell us things about Trump we already knew.
Did he sell condos to Russians? Yeah, and Chinese and Indians and Europeans, and sure, yeah, he did.
But Greg, back to the rape of Russia. The U.S. intelligence agencies and the U.S. Treasury had an operation to rape Russia. Their partner was the Russian mafia. They brought tremendous amounts of Russian mafia money into New York during that period, and every real estate developer, was going for that money. It doesn't mean anything. I mean, if you want to look at who was mobbed up, it was the U.S. Treasury and the CIA. So,
what can little people do? I had Warren Pollock on. What can I'm a little person. What can normal people do? He's talking about getting small. Don't go into debt. Lower your profile. Pay off your car. He started getting down to that. You
want to get as resilient as possible, because here's the problem: you cannot solve a political problem with a financial solution. And when we're talking about the level of lawlessness that we're seeing around the country now, it gets very granular how you protect yourself from that. But you absolutely want to get as resilient as possible, and you want to get as low overhead and low debt as possible. The other thing you want to do is, if your income directly or indirectly depends on the US government, you want to make sure you have alternatives. So, for example, if you're a doctor who's dependent on Medicare and Medicaid payments, see if you can't start a concierge service that is not dependent on that. Do everything you can to diversify your income away from government money, because who knows, one of my allies always says government money comes with a sock in the jaw, but I think government money is going to increasingly come with more and more socks in the jaw. I don't know where the U.S. credit goes, because if we continue to depend on military force, then you better, then the U.S. is planning on having some pretty magical space weapons to pull us all out of this. Not to say that they can't do it. $21 trillion can buy a lot of space weaponry, Greg.
And with that, I've got to stop. It's just fascinating. I mean, you're one of I told you this in the pre-interview. Whenever I have people list people, my favorite people are, and you're almost always listed in the list of favorite people, and you just showed why. We barely scratched the surface just on your quarterly report. I mean, I'm under no obligation. You don't pay me anything to have you on. You don't pay me anything to say that. I just have you on because I think you're good and what you do is good. And so yeah, we just scratched the surface, folks. I'm sorry we didn't get to that much of it. This is just a quarterly report, and there's way more on the website as well, on the Solari Report at solari.com. Catherine Austin Fitts, dazzling, fabulous interview. I feel stupid every time I get done interviewing you. I thought, wow, she's so smart. When I was in the second grade, I thought all the girls were smarter than the guys, because actually they were. I just thought, well, girls are smarter than guys. And you know what? I'm having that same thing right now. All the girls are smarter than the guys. My wife is smarter than me. So anyway, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you coming on. Catherine Austin Fitts, the Solari Report at solari.com. Fabulous website. Fabulous. Thank you so much for coming on USAWatchdog.com.
Thank you. Have a great day.